So I am here today with an incredible author. A lot of my fellow audience will probably know him from being one of the more recent additions to Project Luminous, aka the High Republic, but you've had your fingers in Star Wars for a little while before that, and even before that you've been writing for a very long time. In my research and things, I came across non-fiction works, and you've done editing and all kinds of stuff, and you've worked with Cavan a lot. So it's George Mann, everybody. And so it's an absolute pleasure to speak with you. So starting off really at the beginning, sort of, when did you start writing? Because one thing I've got noted, interestingly, is it seemed in the early 2000s, you actually started writing non-fiction, and then you got into the editing a little bit, and then fiction kind of came about, with things like Sherlock or Sherlock Holmes, I should say. I'm so used to the BBC series that I love. Sherlock Holmes, and obviously some of the comic book adaptations of video games and that stuff. But right at the kind of start of things, how did you get into writing? And was non-fiction the first things that you started with? Kind of tell us about the early journey of George Mann and writing.
Yeah, sure. So I've always written, ever since I was a tiny little kid. One of my most prized possessions actually is a little book I must have written at about the age of 7.5, 8, about a caveman called Noof. And it's literally just like, it's got these terrible like children's drawings in it and this story that makes no real sense. But it has got a beginning, a middle and an end. And it tells the story of a caveman who manages to cook his eggs by getting a crocodile to sit on it. I'm not quite sure that would actually work. But anyway, that's, so, and I used to write these quite often, and I get my dad to photocopy them for me so I could give them to family members. And so I've always written stories and and always read voraciously as well. And I guess from those little kind of childhood picture books, I progressed to actually Dungeons and Dragons, and I got like at the age of about kind of 14, I got really heavily into D&D, and I was the dungeon master, so I was writing stories and kind of using that as an engine to write tales and get people involved in stories. And that lasted basically until I hit young adulthood. But really, I mean, I've always worked with books. At the age of 15, I got a Saturday job in a bookstore after doing my work experience, which we do in the UK. Obviously, it's like a work placement for school kids. And I managed to persuade the local bookstore to let me come work for them, shifting boxes around, putting stock out. And at the end of it, they realised that obviously I knew a fair bit about books. So they offered me a Saturday job, just doing that, stocking shelves, helping customers find books. And I kind of stuck with that. I stuck with that while I went through sixth form. Then I went into it full time, book selling, but carried on writing all the way. I was seeing there was an opportunity to learn more about books, how book publishing worked from that side of things. Getting discount on books, which helped a lot.
It's the nerd's dream. I worked in HMV for a while, and I was like, right, I'm going to buy as many DVDs as I possibly can while I work there as a temp.
No, you understand then, absolutely. So I was doing that, and then I think basically I worked my way up to a store manager eventually, and a buyer for Ottica's book chain that used to exist in the UK. And one of the things, my specialist area was science fiction and fantasy. So I was doing what we called the call stock, which was for the whole Ottica's group. I was looking at what books sell best, what books should be in store, like what's the science fiction fantasy canon, as it's as it were, that should be on a shelf in a bookshop. And from there, I kind of got to the point where I realised there wasn't really a guidebook out for people who wanted to know what science fiction fantasy looked like at that point in time. There was the big kind of Clute-Nichols encyclopedia of science fiction, which is an amazing effort, and it's now an online tome because it's got too big, they can't print it. But back then it was like, I used to get a lot of customers coming in and talking to me about, well, where should I start? I like this type of fiction, I like this author, what else would I like? And I thought this, some sort of guidebook to help them would be great. So I pitched it to a publisher. And lo and behold, they agreed to take the book. I think I misjudged how much of an undertaking it was to write a kind of encyclopedia of your own. Even though it was meant to be a small guidebook, it was still 200,000 words. And I learned a lot writing that book. But it was a way into publishing, and I was writing stories at the same time. But it got me a book, it got me a credit, and it's because I'd seen that gap in the market. So from there, I I started getting some small press fiction published. I wanted to be the big science fiction writer. That was my plan. You know, I loved Peter F. Hamilton and Alistair Reynolds and Stephen Baxter and that school of big science fiction writers. And I thought that was what I was going to do. But inevitably, I'd kind of only get 6 or 7 chapters into a book, and it would just all collapse. At those days, I didn't really understand the process of like how to plan a novel properly, or but also I was forcing myself to try and write this stuff because I thought it was what people wanted to read, and it was what I liked writing. And it was a friend of mine who worked. It was effectively my opposite at Waterstones, doing science fiction buying, and Michael Rowley, and he said to me, "Look, stop worrying about it. Stop trying to write the big science fiction novel. Write something for yourself. Just remind yourself why you do this, why you like writing." And I thought, that's great advice. And I went away and I started dabbling, and I kind of threw in all of the influences that I've had in my life, actually except for Star Wars, but it was Sherlock Holmes, it was Doctor Who, it was Hammer Horror, and I created this thing called this novel called The Affinity Bridge, Newbury and Hobbes book. And I remember calling Michael and saying, "Look, thank you. I've managed to get past the 7th chapter. I'm actually halfway through the book." And he said, "Oh, send it to me." So I did. And little did I know, he sent that to a publisher that he was doing a little bit of consultancy work with and said, "Have a look at this." And the next thing I knew, they came back to me and said, "We've read the first half of this novel. If you finish it, we'll buy it and a sequel."
Wow. So,
Michael, I owe him a lot. I owe him my career, really. So that's how I started getting into publishing. And it's an interesting thing. A lot of people often say to me, "How do you get to write Star Wars?" And Star Wars is kind of an invite-only thing. And the way the advice I always give people is write something of your own first. Like, get your own books out there, get your own voice out there, and then the people who publish Star Wars are paying attention to what's going on in the market. They're looking at what storytellers are doing, and that's how they find you. And it's true. It was true then with Doctor Who, because what happened with Doctor Who was the Doctor Who editor had read my Newbury and Hobbes books and approached me and said, "I want an Edwardian set Doctor Who novel, and I can tell you love Doctor Who and you know how to write in kind of the Victorian Edwardian period. Would you be interested in writing this Doctor Who book?" And that put me on a path to writing Doctor Who books. And obviously I continued to write my own stuff as well. And the same thing happened with Star Wars. Michael Siglain, I'd met him socially. We'd got talking. We discovered a shared love of horror movies, and it's a lot of the same cultural touch points, and Star Wars, of course. And we kind of went away, followed each other on Twitter, as you do. I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and Mike picked up one of I'd written a novel called Wychwood, which is a kind of spooky crime novel with supernatural and folklore-ish elements, mythology elements to it. And a few months later, I saw Mike again at New York Comic Con, and he took me to one side and said, "I read Wychwood. I saw you saw it online, and I read it. And it's got this kind of mythological element to it. Is that fictional? Did you create it, or is that based on kind of historical stuff?" And I said, "No, it's all fictional. I created it." He said, "Fantastic. Would you like to do that for Star Wars?" And he'd had the idea, having read that book, he'd had the idea for Myths and Fables, which I know we'll probably come on to later. But that's the kind of piece of advice I tend to give people, is like, you put yourself out there and write your own stuff. And I love writing in kind of other people's universes that have meant a lot to me, like Doctor Who and like Star Wars. But I always try and write some of my own stuff as well, because I think there are different creative experience doing tie-in and your own stuff.
Yeah, it's freer in a lot of ways, because one of the things I've gathered from speaking to authors, both who create Star Wars and other authors who've created their own things, not Star Wars. I mean, every High Republic author, every Star Wars author, as you say, they've all created stuff beforehand. They didn't just go, "I'm going to write Star Wars, boom." It makes me think of it. Star Wars Celebration, I saw the Villains of the Sequel Trilogy panel, and Gwendolyn Christie, she was like, she was gunning to be in Star Wars for ages, but obviously she wasn't at the right age when the prequels were out, and then the sequel, she was like, "I want to be in Star Wars," and they're like, "Everyone wants to be in Star Wars." But she was like, you just have to kind of do your own thing, keep your eyes, almost your peripherals, vaguely like, yeah, if the opportunity arose and if the right people approached me, I could peripherally go into Star Wars, but don't just go into it I'm going to write just to write Star Wars.
Yeah.
And it's not dissimilar when I talk to people, because I've been podcasting now. I'm nearing 6 years of doing sort of interview style things. And people say to me, why'd you do it? And I was like, I just love the conversation. I love getting to know people. But I say that the number one advice for podcasting and other hobbies is don't go into podcasting thinking I'm going to make loads of money from this, because you won't. But if you go in thinking this is my passion, this is something I want to do for me, and if along the way I can make money from it or something, have your eye peripherally on that, but don't let that be the focus, because then if, or bluntly, when you don't, it won't be soul crushing. Just like if you only write to write Star Wars, there's only a finite amount of authors who can do that. And it's linking in with something I saw Adam Christopher of Shadow of the Sith. He said, also with writing, it's kind of linking with you, what you said about the up to chapter 7 and things. He was like, don't be disheartened if you write something and it doesn't immediately get picked up by a publisher. Because he said, I think he wrote 3 or 4 transcripts before anyone really looked at it. So it's that kind of idea. And linking in with that, I'm intrigued by your writing process of... Like when I spoke to Cavan and Claudia, I really like hearing about how different people, I know you're quite a visual person from what I've heard in other things. So when you write down ideas and things, do you kind of just type and do that? Or have you got like notebooks where you write down things and you've just got lines coming out and annotations? Like what is in your mind, how do you put together a book of especially things like Wychwood and the stuff that's non-Star Wars, where there's not really a clear place to start when it's your own world? How do you go about putting something like that together?
Good question. So ideas aren't a problem. It's I've got books full of ideas, but often one idea alone isn't enough for a book. It's often when you realize that 2 ideas fit together that you start to get something interesting. So yeah, I have multiple notebooks where I'm just jotting down thoughts, ideas. I've got files on my phone actually on notes as well. I often just start a note and just put an image in there. It might just be an image, or and then sometimes those things will start to gather momentum. It's kind of like a bit like a rock rolling down a hill, gather like a snowball gathering things, and it'll pick up other ideas and start to become something interesting. And then you end up with like a premise, which would actually is a good example where I've always wanted to write a crime novel, but I like writing horror and fantasy and mythology, and it was kind of a case of like, what if I wrote a Midsummer Murders but with spooky stuff in it? I love those episodes of Midsummer Murders where you think there's a witch or there's something, and then it always turns out to be something true and prosaic, which is fine. That's what Midsummer Murders do. But I was like, what if it actually really was a witch or something? Let's just probe that a little bit, like the form of a crime novel, but with actual kind of horror elements to it. So then I started kind of thinking, well, I'm going to lean into folklore. I'm going to lean into mythology. All the Green Man type stuff that I love, Robin Hood, and kind of started coming up with. And that you're right, I am very visual. So images, and they tend to go on a Post-it note. So I burn through Post-it notes.
I've got Post-it notes all around me. So I totally get that.
I've got a box full of Post-it notes next to me. But yeah, what I'll do is I'll start to put these images on Post-it notes, and then sometimes those images will start to form set pieces in a story. So, the discovery of the first body, for example, and if you're writing a crime story, it's like, and what does it look like? Okay, and that becomes a set piece, and then okay, I'm going to have if you're writing a Star Wars story, because it's a very similar process, big lightsaber battle, and you've got this in your head how that's going to play out. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this thing this way. So I tend to write them on Post-it notes or file cards, and then they start to become a pile. And then what I'll do is I'll lay those cards out and start looking at, well, okay, is there a story that threads these things? And half the ideas will go away and they'll come into other books later. But I start putting these things together and go, okay, that works with that and that character. And it's often about characters' journeys as well. So if you're writing an original novel for the first time, you're introducing characters. You're working, how am I going to introduce this character and what's the journey they're going to go on? If you're writing a sequel or a book in a series, like a High Republic novel, for example, you'd be looking at, well, where are the characters at the start and where do I need to get them to? What's the journey that's going to put them there? And how do I make it as hard for them as possible? Because otherwise there is no point to the story. That a point of a story is something changes. So you go, okay, well, what are the worst situations for that person to be in? It's one of Cav's questions, actually. I don't know, I'm not sure where he got it from, but it's a great question, because we often brainstorm stuff together, and we'll often say, well, we've got a story about this happening, big monster over here, and blah 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 blah. And he'll say, who's the worst person to be in that situation? That's your lead character, and because that's a great way to, because every scene in a story should contain conflict. So you start to think about, well, there were lots of different layers to conflict. It can be personal conflict, it can be external conflict, interpersonal conflict. So, that's how you start to shape your characters and the journey that they're going to go on. And then for me, as I say, I usually have these kind of visual set pieces the beats I want to hit in the story. And sometimes, you have to sacrifice things because the story changes as you work it out. But yeah, that's kind of the process. It's quite loose for me to start with, and I've described it before to people like coiling a spring. So I'll spend like months and months coiling the spring tighter and tighter and tighter, coming up with ideas or finding the ideas, putting the order to them, and then the actual writing of the book is like this spring uncoiling, because it's just like, right, now I know what I'm doing, here's the story, boom, and it comes out quite quickly.
You almost can't type fast enough because your mind's going like da-da-da, and you're like, wait, slow down, I'm not there yet, I need to rein it back a bit.
Exactly that. And you do, I mean, again, it's always a personal experience, but for me, I have to leave myself just enough room for some discovery in the writing process as well. So I'll know what the plot is, but and the good thing about having an outline is, like, you know that your character is going to go from A to B to C to D, but you might go A off this way a little bit to 8.5, as it were, but then you know where you have to get back to. I have to get them back to B for the story to work. So it's like you can take these little diversions, but where you always know which direction the kind of the main pull of the story is. So I'm very much an outliner these days compared to what I used to be.
Yeah, I mean, being just every time you create any kind of any piece of content, whether or not it gets released or not, it's always a learning process. There's always things you can learn from anything you do. And just writing, like, one of the best pieces of advice that I've heard almost every published and air quote successful author say is, how do you become a successful author? Just start writing. You'll write loads of stuff, and a lot of it will be tosh, but eventually you'll find your stride. You'll work out, what things work and what things don't. And me as an individual, I'm not a writer, but I've found that the best way I learn, and I think most people are like this, is when you make mistakes and things. And if you said to me, I've done quite a bit of graphic design, I worked in an apprenticeship and I did that for several years, and a lot of my podcasting friends have made logos for and things. And people have asked me, like, how do I do that? And I'm like, the way I do it is I make loads of designs I hate. And then I go, what do I not like about those things? Why is that thing not working? Why does that thing not working? You can kind of, by the process of elimination, you can kind of do it like that. Yeah. And so I want to link in, we will get to Star Wars, but I want to ask a little bit more about mythology and things with yourself. And you've always had this draw, and obviously all of your original works as well, they've got a linking with mythology and folklore and legends and things. And I wondered, in your own opinion, if there is a difference, what is the difference between mythology and folklore, and what about the two or the same thing draws you in specifically?
Oh, some good meaty questions there. So I suppose the difference between mythology and folklore, and there's probably a formal definition that I don't know, but to me it's about scale. Folklore tends to be local, fairly local. It's kind of, in particularly like in Britain, you have kind of almost village level folklore or like regional folklore, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere in the world. And the mythology might be more kind of national level or global. So, for example, the classic Greek myths are a prime example of proper mythology. Saint George and the Dragon would be mythology, whereas kind of Black Shuck might be a bit more kind of, you'd probably call that folklore because it's specific to an area. And I think it's interesting what folklore in particularly, what it can tell us about people's kind of their view of the world in the past. The way, sometimes you can imagine a kernel of truth at the heart of these things, and then things that were not understood being interpreted in these fanciful ways that have given rise to these fantastic stories that have become bizarre, headless people riding pigs in forests, and stories that might have been told to scare children to stay away from something dangerous, that then become received wisdom, that then through time have mutated and changed and become something that's like it's completely different. A lot of ghost stories and things that have followed that path. So that's for me, that's the kind of the difference. But and also kind of really what the draw is about them for me. I love kind of how grotesque a lot of folklore is, actually, how bizarre and rooted in kind of horror. The folk horror genre that's been slowly bubbling away since the 70s and has now become a whole kind of subgenre of its own. Lives on that. That's the lifeblood of it. It's that these grotesque things. I mean, a good example for America would be the Headless Horseman. And
I was thinking that. I mean, I love the film. I know it was way before the Tim Burton film, which is excellent. But I thought that, and I also thought of, I think Germany. They have a lot of folklore, and I know that The Witcher, both the series, but the video games and the books, they've linked in. I think it's a lechin. They're like the skull of like a cow, and it's like all the kind of things. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of when you were mentioning that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's that. And that's cool, isn't it? I mean, but it's interesting how many of those things have a common root and you can go back and go, okay, so we've got the Green Man and they've got the Leshin, and actually, if you go all around Europe, there'll be kind of plant-based horrors or figures, that haunt the woods. You think, well, what's the common ancestry in that? I'm fascinated by that idea. Was there something once that, not necessarily a true supernatural entity, but even like, I suppose, another tribe that dressed in the ivory and skulls and things and came marching out of the forest and became these figures over time. I kind of love that idea that because as a writer, my biggest fascination is in stories, and folklore is generally originates from that kind of fireside tradition of telling stories, oral tradition of telling stories, before books were written. And obviously later on, a lot of those things have been captured, but they've been captured in their strange, twisted form, not the original story form. And I love that, and I love how you see new folklore developing as well, like internet memes that become truisms or stories that people pick up and run with. There was the Slender Man, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, I remember that, and everyone, and I was like, I think the generation that was kind of almost targeted, because I was born in the early 90s, so I know when Slender Man came out, I think I was in college sort of time, everyone around me was like, is Slender Man real? Have you played this game? People say the game is based on real life, and it's like, I'm sure it's not, but it's still very freaky to think about.
Yeah, and it's cool, and that's modern folklore. So, and I tend to think, a lot of what we do as writers is kind of create fictional folklore and fictional mythology. I know, we again, try not to jump ahead too much, but I know that's an element of what drew me into Star Wars with those myths and fable stories, and also what's drawn me to Star Wars as a property and IP, a universe, fictional universe, is that George Lucas was creating a myth for the modern age. That was the intention behind his films. And I think he's very successfully done it.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's one of those things. I was speaking to my friend earlier in the week, and we were speaking about the funny thing is with writing and things and stories, and we were speaking about Jane Austen and Shakespeare and those sort of things. And when you think of pillars of writing, you go back hundreds of years. But when you realise stories were about, basically, as soon as humans could communicate in language, it was around that. But an example I use, so apologies for listeners who've already listened to the podcast, it will be out a few weeks prior, is my example I used was crows. Crows are very intelligent beings, but if you're nice to a crow, then they'll often go off to their crow friends, and then all the crows will come and be nice to you. And other animals do that. But there's a way of them communicating, and I think it started off with danger, and it's just, don't eat that berry, or don't go near the big scary thing, it's going to get you. And I think that throughout history, as language has developed over the hundreds of thousands of years that humans have been developing, as you say, stories around campfires, and they've evolved into different things. And one thing I very much enjoy, and I know that the High Republic is tackling this element, I mean, the Drengir linking in with the plant life and things like that, but it's dissonance. And I think one of the things that I find the scariest about lichens or Drengir and things like that is plants are the lifeblood of Earth. You know, the only reason we're about is because of water, you know, bacteria and plants. And so the idea that having a plant that's trying to kill you, aside from, you know, ones that are just generally poisonous anyway, or you touch them and you get ill, ones that are actually actively trying to get you is such a terrifying thought, because we view trees as protectors. They've always, throughout history, an incredible amount of cultures, you know, and you go through the forest and it's so beautiful and you feel at ease. The idea that nature, the most natural thing, is trying to actively get you is something that's very scary. And I think that's where the horror and the mythos and things kind of link together. Is the scariest for me personally is dissonance.
Yeah, no, I totally see that, and you're right. I mean, you know, the natural world is supposed to be our friend, and you know, the plant horror goes back. You know, I don't know how far, but I mean, you got Day of the Triffids in the kind of 60s. I think the novel was as a start. You know, probably long before that, but yeah, the idea that you know your very surroundings can turn against you and try to kill you is one of the true staples of horror. It's, you know, yeah, properly terrifying. And so I think that's what the Drengir are doing, definitely in the High Republic. And I think there's a touch of that in the Nameless as well.
I was going to mention, especially reading your miniseries, The Nameless Terror, which is linking in quite nicely, is with The Nameless Terror. I think that links in with the Jedi. You know, I know Cavan, he said numerous times in High Republic interviews and things, what do the Jedi fear? What's the true thing of this? And the idea of the Nameless and the Leveler, and that idea of the Jedi are the Guardians. They're the things that are safe. If everything's, you know, going mad around you, you hide behind the Jedi because they won't experience fear. They've learned to go through that. And then what is something that cuts through everyone? And the Battle of Jeddah really goes in on that. And also I just finished Lydia Kang's Cataclysm, and that goes into that as well. It's that thing of, if you're on a battlefield and the Jedi are the protectors and you're hiding behind them being like, right, they're going to be the ones we follow. And if they're the only ones being affected by the fear, the whole safety net breaks down, and that's where horror really seeps in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's really interesting, because that's kind of like the view of everyone who isn't a Jedi is exactly that. It's like the Jedi are supposed to be our protectors, and this is terrifying them and is a threat to them. But for a Jedi themselves, the idea that it's the same. You know, we're just talking about the natural world and being our friends. Like, the Force is supposed to be the one thing that, you know, they can always rely on, that it upholds, you know, everything. And the fact that their use of the Force makes them a target for the Nameless is, you know, must be absolutely horrific. A horrific thing to experience. It's, you know, these terrifying creatures are coming for me because of who I am and what I do. And there's no way to stop it. That's great.
It is. It's amazing. And we've touched on Star Wars then, so we'll delve in a little bit. But before we do, whenever I speak to authors of Star Wars, I obviously primarily consume content around Star Wars, especially at the moment. I'm trying my best, as people see behind me. But I always want to know, when I spoke with Claudia Gray, she recommended House of L is one of the pieces of content that she made. You know, Cavan, he's currently working on a Shadow Service, and then there's also The Ward. I know he's doing hundreds of things as well behind the scenes. Before delving into Star Wars, if there's any one piece of content of yours that someone who maybe is enjoying Star Wars, that only knows you from Star Wars, if it was Wychwood or Newbury and Hobbes or anything, if there's one piece of content you recommend to people to purchase of yours, to delve into something you've created, what would you recommend for those people? I'll put a link in the show notes to it, but I always want to try and promote people's stuff that isn't purely Star Wars, because I do feel somewhat, not quite bad, but I'm always like, I'm so happy I get to speak with you and I know your work due to Star Wars, but I don't want your Star Wars work to eclipse the many years and all the hard work you've put in other content. So please let us know about that stuff.
Yeah, honest answer is probably, if it was a single book that I was most proud of, I think I'd probably direct people to Wychwood. But actually, what I would say is probably as a body of work, Newbury and Hobbes. The reason I say that is, you know, it's a series that I started, I think it was 2008 the first book came out, so it's been going a long time. There's 6 full novels, there's a graphic novel, there's a novella, there's a short story collection, there's comic strips, there's a soundtrack. You know, it's developed. And I think, you know, my skills as a writer developed, so I think the series improves as you read through it as well. But I fairly recently, like sort of last summer, published what's ostensibly the final novel in the series. I've had a lot of people kind of trying to persuade me to come back, and I have left it at a point where I could do so in the future. So I might yet come back to it, but at the moment, it's a complete piece of work, and something I'm very proud of. And so that's probably where I would point people.
Incredible. Yeah, it's amazing. And I'll be delving into that. My thing is, whenever I have an interview, a conversation with someone on the podcast and it's Star Wars adjacent or anything like that, I make a note and I will purchase at least one thing just to make sure, because I don't want to just be narrow-minded in my view of that. But we'll link into Star Wars, but I also want to ask about video games. Because you've made a lot of writing of comic books. You've got Dark Souls, you've got Warhammer 40k. You've definitely delved into that realm as well. And obviously, Dark Souls especially is very leaning into horror. Although the gameplay itself is, I mean, it's kind of actiony, but you're so weak in that game and you get destroyed so easily. It's very, very close to horror, if not actually horror. So I want to ask, do you have a general love of video games, or is it more the horror element has kind of got you into the lore of things that primarily take place in video games? I know that Warhammer's probably the only franchise I can think of that matches Star Wars for lore, if not potentially even exceeds it. But I just wondered, before we delve a little bit into Star Wars, do you have a love of video games, or is it more the horror stuff that kind of got you into that world?
It's actually a bit of both. So I do enjoy horror games, and I enjoyed gaming in general, tabletop gaming as well. The Games Workshop side of things is a slight tangent, because I worked for them for 15 years.
Wow.
And so after working the bookstores, I went to work in the Black Library, which is their fiction publishing imprint. And after a few years, ended up taking over and running that department. And then after a few years more, taking over running their entire design studio, aside from the kind of miniature sculptors, but all of the lore and the art teams and the writing, the writers, which was a fantastic experience, because I got to kind of work with these hugely talented people, and this IP that has existed for years and years and years and years, and add to it and develop it. And so when Titan came to me to write the comic, I left Games Workshop at that point, but obviously I knew the IP and I knew the world, and so it was great fun to actually come at it from another angle. With Dark Souls, recently Dragon Age is another comic series I've written for Dark Horse. It's I guess I don't know why. I guess it must be what I talk about, because a few editors come to me now and saying, "You like video games, don't you? Do you like this one?" And I was like, "Yes, I do." So I mean, I love fantasy games of all types. So Dragon Age, absolutely. Dark Souls, I do love the horror elements of Dark Souls. I find it very hard.
Yes.
I'm not very good at playing Dark Souls. Zelda, I mean, I haven't played the new one yet because I'm on deadline. So it's kind of like, that's my reward when I finish the next book, is to buy myself the new Zelda game, because I know I'll lose a few weeks into it.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, but the problem is I don't have a lot of time for playing video games anymore. I've got responsibilities, children, lots of books to write, lots of comics to write.
Your monthly mandates with Cav as well, which are very wholesome. I love hearing about those. But that's a lot of fun.
On Tuesday.
Oh, so amazing!
Looking forward to that.
It's one of those with like working, because like, a lot of my friends play a lot of video games, and in college I used to play all the time. Halo was a big one. I've clocked up a silly amount of hours on that game. But I used to love the single player games. As Darksiders is one which I thoroughly enjoyed, and like I bought Jedi Survivor day of release. I played it 2 hours, because at the moment I'm like, I do this podcast, I do my other podcast, Star Wars Comics and Canon, and that takes up a huge amount of time, as well as socializing and things. And I'm also reading a lot of the High Republic things, and I'm like, I just finished Cataclysm, and I'm like, I can't play Survivor because I've still got Quest for Planet X, and also I've got Path of Vengeance, which they're downstairs. And I've never been more thrilled, and I never thought in my teen years I would be choosing to read over playing video games. I'd always thought, but because of time-wise and things, video games, because they take up a huge amount of time, as much as I love them, I think like you, where I get, not quite obsessed, but I get so drawn in, and then I'm like, all I want to do is just do that thing. So linking in, we'll go into Star Wars now, as we're in sort of past the second half of our time together. One thing I wanted to note with you, I heard you speaking on the Houdini podcast. It was the Living Force, and it was talking about sort of when you wrote the audio drama for Battle of Jeddah and how that's different from writing some other content. So people should check that out to hear that element of the conversation. But I want to ask more so about Quest for the Hidden City. Which people should be able to see. There we go, behind me. Which I loved it, and obviously there's horror elements to that as well, which is really cool. How with Battle of Jeddah, it's a very. I've got the script book there, but I listened to the audio drama of that, and I found that that is quite a. It's quite a mature piece of content. There's, to be blunt, there's quite a bit of death in it, as with a lot of the High Republic stuff. Whereas with Quest for the Hidden City, I won't say any spoilers or anything because I'm always encouraging people to pick up the junior novels. The junior novels are incredible. They're so good. But you as a writer, a lot of your content has been either YA focused or slightly on the more mature side due to the supernatural or due to the horror elements that you and Cavan both love, in all of your works, even if it is available for all ages, you can still feel the veins of horror in that. So I want to ask specifically with Quest for the Hidden City, I know that obviously with the 3 books you've written, the sort of Myths and Fables trilogy in a sense, that's short stories and things, and that doesn't delve into the intensity of certain High Republic content does, and I'm sure the upcoming Phase 3 book that you're writing as well, that's going to go a lot into it because that's an air quotes adult book. But how was writing a junior novel different to writing some of the other content that you've written that isn't aimed at such a young audience when you still want to keep up the intensity and the horror elements? Like, how is writing that different, and how is it a challenge for you as a writer?
Good question. So first and foremost, I think the thing is you've got to respect your reader no matter how old they are.
Yeah.
So one of the things I never enjoyed as a young reader myself, or as an adult reader reading to my kids, was when I felt that a author was talking down to the child. Because, kids can grasp complex things, complex subjects, sometimes better than adults can, who are a bit stuck in their ways. And I think, you've got to approach it, you've in much the same way as you would with any Star Wars story initially. So I think the kind of your starting point is the same. I've got to tell a great Star Wars story, and it's going to have some Jedi, it's going to have some peril, it's going to have some monsters, some tension, and all those things I was saying earlier about kind of your big set pieces and stuff. I did exactly the same. I had this cool set piece with Sandra and a shield in the swamp with the monsters, and some pretty dark stuff. Finding Rock Burren. I know this is a little bit of a spoiler, but he's been stranded on that planet. I won't say what's happened, but he's been stranded on that planet, Gloam, and pretty nasty things have happened to the rest of his team. But I think the key thing is that then you're telling the same sort of story. I could have told that story as an adult story if I'd written it from Solandra's point of view. Mm-hmm. But I didn't. I kind of got down and went, right, I'm going to get into Rupert's head and I'm going to get into Das's head and tell the story from their perspective. All the events are the same, but we're experiencing it from a child's point of view. So trying to look at my own kids and go, right, how does a child experience the world? How do they see the world differently from an adult? Sometimes it's naivety. Sometimes it's not burdened actually by kind of preconception. It can be a lot more black and white. It can be, are we going to save the guy or are we not going to save the guy? We're Jedi, aren't we? Let's, what are we going to do? So I think that's the key thing is, and then once you're in the book and you're writing it from that child's point of view, it's almost a case of going, right, the same things are going to happen, but at what moment does the camera pan away? So you don't see some of the things that you'd show in an adult novel. You imply it. You can almost imagine the kids screwing up their eyes and looking the other way, and and it happens, and and you hear it even, like the squelch of something, or the hum of a lightsaber chopping something off. And there are things you do have to do. You have to think about the obvious things, like you're not going to show drug abuse or you're not really going to get into sexuality in a middle grade novel. You are in a YA novel, probably more than an adult novel, but not in a middle grade novel really. And the monsters really pretty much need to be monsters. You need to think like there are bad guys, and they have to be the bad guys for the good guys to win out. You know, there's a quite a clear thing. Whereas actually in an adult novel, you'd paint your characters probably a bit more grey on both sides, because you're trying to show the complexities of, like, you know, there's no simple argument really. You know, like even the Nile have got a point. You know, stop clocks right twice a day and all of that sort of stuff. You know,
You did that in Battle of Jeddah with the brothers of the ninth something or other.
Yeah,
they're the dark side users who have got a bit of they're dark side users and they've got that negativity towards them. But you said, I think in one of the other interviews I heard of you, you didn't go, these are bad because they're dark side. And one of your perceptions I quite enjoy is dark side does not equal evil. It's normally a path that eventually leads to evil by its nature, but they're the kind of areas you can explore the greyness a bit more. Whereas, as you say, in the younger writing, it has to be a bit more clear and a bit less existential in some ways.
Yeah. So you dial those things up. But no, thank you for spotting that with the Brothers of Night's Door, because my perception, kind of perspective on the dark side, is that it's a step that people take because they're scared. And you know those first steps on that road are often driven by fear, and that's something that's encoded in Star Wars. We always say, you know, fear leads to anger, leads to all of that. But actually, you know, you can't blame people for being scared, and it's like, you know, and doing what they need to do to protect themselves, and it doesn't automatically make them bad people. And that's really what I wanted to explore with the Brothers of the Night's Door, was that idea that you know, it's complex. You know, Mitian is in that novel, or audio novel, is a villain, but not all of the Brothers of the Night's Door are. And you know, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the short stories I was doing in Star Wars Insider.
Not yet, because I will say I was waiting for. I've got Starlight Stories here of the hardback collection, so I'm hoping. I know it's a slightly shorter phase. I'm really hoping that Tales of Enlightenment comes out in a nice little collection like that. So I'm afraid it's the only piece of High Republic content I haven't. But if not, I'll be buying those back issues. But I'm hoping for a nice collectible one.
I mean, I can't say one way or another, but what I will say is it would be highly irregular if they didn't do something with them.
Yeah.
But yeah, one of those stories in particular, the idea with those stories, they're all set in the Bar of Enlightenment, and it's a bit like Cheers. You know, you've got this gang of regulars that you meet in Battle of Jeddah, and Pirali, Muna, Kef, and people come into the bar and they tell a story, basically. So they're like nested stories, or something happens in the bar that sheds light on what's going on in the grander phase 2. And so in one of those stories, you have a brother of the Ninth Door who comes in, and they're all kind of looking at him going, he's a bit, you know, suspect, that guy over there. He's a bit suspicious. We know who he is. You know, he wears a bone mask and he's and dark cloaks, you know. And then again, this is a slight spoiler, but the robbers come into the bar, basically, and a gang bursts in, and he's the guy who saves them. And at the end, Pirali's says to him, because they've got this ability to cloud people's perception of them, so that they can, you know, you don't know quite what you're seeing. You think you might be seeing somewhat, so he kind of disguises himself and does what he does. And Pirali says to him at the end, "You could have walked out. You could have walked out. You could have disguised yourself and walked out at any time." He said, "Well, but why would I do that when I had the opportunity to help people?" And you know, and I love playing with that expectation of, he's a darksider, but he still chose to help people. Now, I think, you know, you look at the Sith, they're an extreme end of that spectrum, you know, but so are the Jedi at the other end. They're the extreme kind of like, we're going to help everyone. And the Sith are the extreme kind of selfish end of it. I'm all in it for power. But if it's a spectrum, then there's got to be people, not Jedi, not Sith, but people who engage with the Force at different points on that scale. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we've gone on a tangent there. But
love it.
But to get back to your original point, I think that so with middle grade, you're dialing up the bad guys are clearly bad guys, and which is why when you meet the Katakut villains in it, they're not Katakut anymore. They've been, you know, the shells of ancient Katakut have been transformed into monsters by kind of living rocks. Because then it's kind of fine for the Jedi to hit them with lightsabers. You know, and you're not going to traumatize any kids who are like, oh, but you know, they were talking to other Katakut recently on the other planet. So you've got to have a clear kind of distinct moral distinction, and actually a clear lesson, I think, for the characters to learn as well. So again, it's exactly what I was talking about earlier. there's a character journey, and it's about showing change. It's just you might wear it a bit more on your sleeve in a middle grade novel than you would. It's kind of not, you don't have the room to be subtle. It's like, Rupert goes into that going, I just want to have adventures, and I'm bored with all the negotiating and lightsaber training, and comes out of it going, whoa, okay, if that's what an adventure is, maybe there's a reason why we don't get involved in it all the time. And kind of biting off more than she could chew. And that's a very clear lesson that she's learned there. Das goes on a slightly different journey where, kind of healing his relationship with his father, and also coming to the point where he's going, like, actually, the path that we all thought I was on, I'm not on that one. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to do something different. I've seen a different part of the world, and I feel I belong in that, which is another valuable thing for children, I think, to read about and be able to then put themselves in that position.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's, Star Wars at its core, although, it started off as films and George Lucas creating this amazing world, and it's, space fantasy more so than sci-fi, I'd argue, but it's about lessons. That's the end of the day. It's all, the core original story was, Darth Vader, he was a Jedi, he turned to the dark side. Obviously in the prequels added more weight to that, and I love the prequels, to clarify. I mean, I love all the Star Wars films. I'm very much about Star Wars positivity. All of them have flaws, even the originals, but I love all Star Wars, be it written, be it comics, being any type. I'm just, give it to me. But it's all about the lessons, and the prequels I grew up with the prequels, so this is slightly controversial, but I actually prefer the prequels for me than the originals in a lot of ways, because that journey, it's very dark, but it's a lesson. It's a hard lesson to learn, especially when I eventually have kids and they grow up and I have to show them Anakin's fall. And it's like, even now when I watch episode 3 and I watch that scene with him and Mace and Palps in the room, and every time I watch it, and I've seen that film 20 plus times, if not more, every time I'm like, don't do it, please, I beg of you. And it's just, I think that Star Wars being a part of my formative years, and my late father, he loved Star Wars. He's one of the reasons that I think I'm so into it as well. I think that one of the things I want to show my kids about Star Wars, and I've even got, like, this is how much I love the High Republic and stuff. I've even got these ones, and I know you did 2 of them, I think, and Cav did one as well. I bought these specifically because I'm like, when the kid's old enough, or as young as they can, but old enough to vaguely remember, I'm going to start with these and slowly work my way up, and I'm going to hopefully use Star Wars to teach lessons. That's what I'm hoping. And it's kind of, as you say, the Force is a spectrum, like many things in this world are, and I'm really intrigued by the characters that are in the middle in a lot of ways. People like Maz Kanata, she's not quite middle, but she likes to, as Daniel Jose Older's touching upon in the High Republic Adventures comics and things, she's the pirate queen, but we see her in The Force Awakens and she's basically just good, but she's got a bit of grey to her. People like Elzar Mann from Phase 1, who's probably my favourite character in Phase 1, he toes the line a bit. And I think characters, when they're a bit more complex, especially when you're older and you can have these more complex thoughts, I find them very intriguing. And so when you wrote the Brothers of the Ninth Door, I was very intrigued by those, because one of my favorite things about the High Republic is that when most new characters are introduced, we get what their perception of the Force is. And one of my favorite things, there's the Chronicles of the Jedi, the illustrated guide. There's some really great illustrations there of showing how Buriaga views the Force, how Ezra Mann does, and there's a lot of Jedi who view it in water things. And I believe that in Quest for the Hidden City as well, you tackled it, if I'm remembering correctly, was Rupert, is it the wind? I can't fully remember.
It's kind of colours.
That was it. That was even better. The wind is another one. But with that element of things, exploring, because I know we're starting to wrap up here, exploring those elements of perception of the Force. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about writing characters like that, and to a degree the freedom in, I think, what the High Republic, the architects kind of started with Phase 1, being able to explore different perceptions of the Force while still a lot of the core values still being there. I wonder if you could explore that a little bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, just to start off with, I think the 5 original architects did an amazing job kind of setting things up and working with Lucasfilm to kind of provide us with that freedom. And Lucasfilm have been amazing in the freedom that they've given us to explore these things. But yeah, I think you're right. It always comes back to the Jedi all have different ways that they feel or engage with the Force, but they're all still Jedi. And I think it's interesting to I think more than ever, the way I'm engaging with writing High Republic Jedi is I'm thinking them as real people who make difficult choices, who sometimes doubt themselves. You think about the Jedi, like it must be hard to wake up every day and be like 100% right. I'm selfless. I'm just going to do, serve the Force and do good for everyone. And that's impossible. Actually, it's impossible. And you see that with all of the characters in Star Wars. You see that with Luke. But I think that's kind of like trying to think about the differences that make us the same. Almost, if you see what I mean. It's like looking at the world and the diversity that is evident amongst all the people who are around us. Trying to put yourself in their shoes, and at the end of the day, it's a similar thing. It's like we all have core, or most of us have core human values that we like to uphold. Most of us would help people if we saw them in trouble, and you kind of think, but actually, the person who lives next door to me probably has a very different view of the world than I do. I sit here and write books and live in my head all day. He mends fences. He's very talented physical labourer who, I've seen him work. But his perception of the world is going to be very different to me. And I think maybe if he's thinking of, thinking about how the world works, he might see it in a different way. He might think about it in physical terms, he's someone who makes and does with his hands, whereas I'm very cerebral, really, in the sense that I kind of most of my day is dreaming up stories and writing stories. So our experience of the world is very different, and I think that's what we're trying to do with the Jedi when we go, actually, Elzar sees the Force as water, and the dark side is deeper and the light side is shallower. That's a cool analogy. Avar hears the song of the Force, and Rupa has a kind of a synesthesia type of thing where life is different colours, and different types of life are different colours. And
that we use it as a story device. I will say, I apologies for forgetting that element of things. So many Jedi characters, but the way you use that as a storytelling device, and I also think that I've got obviously everything is a spectrum and things, but I think that when it comes to people who are more neurodivergent, especially people who are maybe further up the scale on autistic elements, and I've got autistic tendencies as well myself, I think the colour element of things I found to be really helpful for perception, and I think it's a really great way of using it as a storytelling device, while also being a parallel of how younger people, I mean people do in general, but especially younger people, can see the world. And the colours are, an analogy for the black and the white of the world, being able to see things in a much more clearer way. But you use the Force and metaphor to illustrate that, which I found to be beautiful in the book.
Thank you. Appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I was intrigued, but I've got a friend who's has got synesthesia and an artist and paints these amazing, vibrant pictures. But also it was that song by Lord, Greenlight, which, when on the surface, you think about she's waiting for that green light. You think it's the green light of go, but actually, when I read an interview with her, she'd say, no, it's not that at all. She's got synesthesia, and she's talking about, and that song is about waiting for an emotion, but she sees that emotion as a green light, and that was what gave me the idea for Rupa, and thinking, okay, maybe that's how she engages with the Force and the world. So thanks to Lord for that.
That's incredible. Big shout out to Lord. We'll start to wrap up here. I will ask you something when I stop recording as well, just to clarify, so you don't dart off too quickly. But sort of final words, I'll put links in the description to your website and to your social media, and obviously to your other works that are non-Star Wars related as well. But any sort of final words to any of the listeners about anything you've got going on, any fun thing, just the floor is yours, good sir.
The main thing I'd like to say actually is thank you for reading our books, but particularly the High Republic. The thing that amazes me so much is the way people have embraced this era, embraced these characters, have taken them to heart, and love them as much as we do. And no more than at Star Wars Celebration have I seen that. We had a room with 3,500 people in there.
I was in that room.
Thank you. But that was a room that was full of people who read books. It's like you were saying earlier, you're excited to read books rather than play a video game. And, there were 3,500 people in that room who all felt the same, who were there because of books. And as someone who's always worked in books and always loved books and sees the value in books, that was so special. So yeah, I mean, people who are listening are here because we're here talking about Star Wars books probably more than anything else. And so just thank you for reading. Keep reading.
Yeah, and thank you. I've said it on social media a bit, and I try and illustrate it when I speak to yourself and other Star Wars and High Republic authors. Of just, you have legitimately given me a passion for reading again. And I used to read a ton when I was a kid and when I was growing up and things, and then as I got older and things, it kind of took a step back. Video games took a front forward, but since me getting back into Star Wars and the canon, got reset and things, and I've managed to kind of start from square one.
Yeah.
The High Republic especially, I've never been more excited for deliveries of books. And every night now, when my fiance now recently got engaged, so that it's still a bit of a thing. But whenever she goes to bed early, now I'm like, yes, I get to read my books. And your books are among the ones that I just absolutely adore. So thank you as well for reigniting the passion and for continuing. And people like you, and also all the other High Republic and Star Wars authors, your passion is genuinely infectious, and seeing the High Republic stuff has been incredible. And I can't wait to see all of Phase 3 and what we've got to go there and anything that lies beyond. So just thank you as well, good sir.
Thank you. Gird your loins for Phase 3.